understand the extent of your responsibility with regards to the purchase. So you want to know who's responsible. So we've talked about, just to recap, we've talked about the wall, we've talked about the roof, we've talked about the chimney. Typically, what tends to happen in a lot of buildings in the UK, especially buildings in London, assume that this is the building. Assume that this is the building from the side. You're looking at the side view. What tends to happen is some buildings will have what we call extensions. These extensions could be ground level extensions, or someone else has extended a second level. Let's make an example. Let's say you are purchasing this flat and it's been extended. It's important to understand the nature and the extent of the extension. On the other hand, you could be buying a property that is on the upper floor, or it could be a property where they've converted the roof. So they've put an extension on the roof and you have a roof light, and at the rear they've put what we call a dormer. A dormer is simply an extension of the roof. You want to know the condition of the extension. In two parts, I will explain this in a different video. The first is you want to understand compliance. Did the installation comply with the building regulations, standards, building regs? And number two, was planning approved? The reason you want to understand this is because normally buildings, original buildings, this is if you're buying a flat, are insured for the original structure. Usually, the dormer comes with a 1-year additional warranty. Most people will not extend the insurance to include the dormer. So it's important you understand the nature of the installation. Did it comply with building regulations? Did it get planning approved? Because some insurance companies will not insure the building if you haven't got compliance, or they might insure the building at a significant premium, which would mean that your operational management cost will be much higher. So you want to understand this. Now, in order for you to understand the nature, you have to insist when you do your viewing that they allow you to see the rear. You want to see the rear of the building so that you can observe what's going on at the back. There are times when the ground floor and the ground floor garden belongs to someone else. So you're not allowed to go through someone else's property to observe. What I tend to do is, let's come back to this one. This is the aerial plan view. What I tend to do is, if that is the case for me, I would complete my viewing. Once the agent has left, I would walk around the streets and see if I can go to the rear part of the building, maybe through a pathway or from another street. Sometimes, if it's a detached building, I might ask the neighbor if they would allow me to go to the back and just have a look. Remember, you're there to collect data. Be courteous, be polite, but be very, 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 very detailed in your process. Don't be ashamed. Wear a smile. It's perfectly fine for you to explain to the person or to people the reason why you like to have a look. But most people, when they come to view a property, they come in through the front door, they go upstairs, they view the property and they leave. Now, one of the main reasons I'm stressing these extensions is because when we get to the sessions where we talk about valuation, I will explain the importance of understanding the value of each space. All floor spaces are not created equal. I'm going to give you a very, very brief snippet, a very brief explanation so you understand what I'm saying. Traditionally, buildings in the UK depending on whether it was a period building, what used to happen was the ground floor and the first floor were usually the main part of the building, whether the building was a Georgian house, a Victorian house, or an Edwardian house. The top floor was usually for the servants. And so I'd like you to make this observation. You tend to find that when you visit a building, the ground floor usually has very high floor to ceiling heights. Maybe it might be, say, 2.8 meters on the ground floor. The first floor might be 2.8 meters. But when you go to the top floor, it might be 2.1 meters. It'll be smaller, it has smaller windows, whereas the ground floor might have big, high sash windows, beautiful windows. The reason is because traditionally, the ground floor was the entertainment room, the top floor was where the master bedroom would be, and the guest bedroom, and the servants would be in the loft or in the upper floor. Buildings that had basements or lower ground levels, you would have the kitchen, and the kitchen would also have a much shallower floor to ceiling height, maybe 2.1. Forgive me, I said 2.1 here. 2.1 would not comply with the regulations, although you do have those scenarios. This could be, say, 2.4 or 2.3. This might be 2.3. So much shallower. When people do extensions, you have to understand that the price you pay for the ground floor cannot be the same as the price you pay for an extension. It just cannot be the same. Extensions are not created equal. So you have to understand whether the space you're viewing is an extension. If you come in through the front door and you carry out your internal viewing without an appreciation for the layout of the space or the positioning of the space, you could run the risk of buying a property or flat and overpaying. And what could have happened here is someone could have bought this entire house, put this extension, put that extension, and sold the entire building to you, and you would have thought that what you were buying was a building that was designed as one single design by one single architect, for example, without realizing, no, this is an extension. Therefore, it's not the same quality of space. This is an extension. It's also not the same quality of space. And that's the reason why I spent some time explaining that. So I hope I haven't perhaps bored you with too much information. Let me summarize. No, sorry. I've given you a summary so far. I feel as though I should include, just before I conclude, I should include the grounds. The grounds. Forgive me, but let me start with a different paper. Let's start with the aerial view. That's the building. That's the roof, chimney. Let's assume that is a lot, what we call the entire land area of the building. Let's also assume that all of this is the front garden, and this is the rear garden. Let's assume that maybe there's space for parking here, and on this section you have the bins and maybe a section for bikes, storage. We're talking about, in this section, we're talking about the grounds, dealing with the grounds, having an understanding of what to look out for. And this is the building, this is the front porch, this is the entrance, this is for cars, this is for pedestrians, and this is the garden. The first thing you want to understand when you do the viewing is to ask questions. Question number 1. What area is shared? This could be a two-car driveway. Let's assume that there are 4 flats. You might be buying this thinking, well, we have a car, we can park on the driveway. And the property may have been sold on the basis that it has 2 parking spots. But the lease document, which at this stage you will not have access to, might say something very different. So you want to ask questions. You want to ask, what area is the shed? Is the rear garden shed? Is the front garden shed? Because there are times when the front garden is exclusively for the use of one flat. This is assuming that you're buying a flat in a building. There are also times when the rear garden is also exclusively used by one flat. So you want to know what is shed. The garden, the front, the rear, the driveway, the bike shed, the bins. Number 2, you want to know whether there are any trees. I said in the very first session that my preference, it's preferable not to have trees close or too close in proximity to the house. And the reason is because as the trees start to grow, the roots could cause damage to the structure of the building. This could lead to which could lead to movement. As this breaks, as this moves, the clay or whatever material underneath the foundation could start to move, which would lead to cracks on the brick. Subsidence. The floors have to subside, and therefore you have cracks on the building because of the proximity of the trees to the structure. So you want to look out for the location of trees. Now, I'd like to talk about something else. This is the front of the building, and this is the rear. Okay, boundary wall. You want to ask questions. Who is responsible for repairing the boundary wall? But also, the inspection is not a time for all of these questions. I said to you before, ask questions relentlessly. Let me share something that may not come across too nice, but my experience is most agents, property sales agents in the UK, are not very technically trained. They're not well trained technically. Anyone can become a sales agent. Very few of them develop their memory. To be a good agent, you need 2 qualities. You must be curious, and you simply have to have an interest in buildings. In other words, if a client says, what type of building is it? You should be able to tell. If the client says, what area is a shed? You should be able to tell. Most agents, from my experience, have very little interest in the buildings themselves. The only interest they have is just selling it. And this means you may not get enough answers from an agent, but it's worth asking. Sometimes when you do the viewing, the owner or the seller might be present, so you could ask the seller directly. But you want to at least make an observation about the quality. Now, why is it important to make an observation about the quality of the boundary walls? The reason is because you're buying a flat, for example, or you're buying the entire building. You want to know and you want to observe the physical state. If this is in a very messy state, then you should be deducting the cost of repairs from the price that you'll be paying to purchase the property. Or you can say to the owner, I'll pay you the full price. However, I like all of this repaired. So the front garden, the boundary walls are very important. Next, if this is a garden at the rear, usually we have fences. You want to observe the condition of the fence. Again, I mentioned in the previous page about this word. What are my responsibilities? Now, if the lease document states that the cost of repairing the fences is jointly shared, then you want to know the condition of the fences before you make an offer. Why? For a typical building like this, to install a brand new fence, usually these fences will last between 10 and 15 years. Some will last longer, but it depends on how exposed they are to the elements, and more importantly, it depends on the quality of the existing fences. So you have to make allowances that when you're viewing or when you're buying a house, some repairs will be needed within the next 3 to 4 years. And therefore, you want to understand what the cost will be. And ideally, you want to be shrewd. You want to transfer the cost to the seller. To replace a fence, an entire fence like this, could set you back, including workmanship, including the cost of the labor. This could cost you roughly about sometimes even more. The main cost is labor, the labor cost. Sometimes this could even go as far as 7,000. Why? Because maybe there is a gate that leads into the garden and it needs a lock, and it's a different, more secured gate, and then the fence all the way through. And you want to also understand the quality of the front garden. Sometimes the front garden, if it's if it's bricked, then you have to get someone to install all the bricks. It's like building a house, although it's the height of the fence won't be so much. It'll be quite shallow, quite low in height. So, but this could easily set you back something in the region of about 30,000 to 8,000 because you're using brick now. So it's much more expensive. So just looking at the grounds, imagine you're paying 7,000 for the rear, and 8,000. That's another 15,000. If you add this to the 16,000 from the prior pages, that's 31,000. If you were buying this entire building yourself, that's the extra amount you would have to pay in a few years for the repairs. If there were 4 flats in this building, then you're looking at something in the region of about, forgive me for my poor math. I'm going to guess this now. This is a complete guess, but I could be wrong in my sums. And it could be 7.5 plus 250, so 7,750. That's what it will cost you. So it's important you understand. Now, let me conclude with the last thing to look out for. You might arrive and you ask yourself the question, how many flats are in the building? The easiest way to know is to ask the agent. But trust but verify. When you get to the property, always make an observation. How many bells do you see? Number 1. Number 2, how many gas meters can you see? Or electricity meters. Just ask. You want to observe where are the meters, gas, electricity, water. Just make that observation. So that, I guess, concludes the externals. The video is much longer than I thought, but you would remember in the introduction session I made reference to the fact that when you're purchasing a property, usually 90% of the value is in the building itself, the structure, or the land. Structure and or the land. And then 10% is the interior. It's all the cosmetics. Because most of the time, when you're purchasing a property, sometimes the furniture will not remain. So you are really getting just the fixed equipment or the fixed furnishing. So it's not much. Usually it's between 95% will go to the structure and the land, and 5% to 10% will go to the interior or whatever is left in the building. So most of your value is on the externals, and that's the reason why I've spent more time dealing with the externals. So if you get the externals right, everything else will be okay, because this is just internal cosmetics. Now, I said something to you. Let me just go back, which is I said in the first page, I said that there is a flow process, and you need not remember everything that I've explained. The reason is because if you were buying with a loan, a mortgage, or you're using investors' capital, a survey will be done by a professional, and the professional will identify and pick up all of these items that I have raised. The only problem is, it's important to have an idea first, because when you make your offer, you want to make your offer with all of this information taken into consideration. So if you're discounting 31,000 from the price, then you know that the offer you've made is complete. You don't have to renegotiate. You don't have to go back and change terms. You can make the decision taking into account that at this point in time, you've been well informed. This survey will identify, because it will be a lot more detailed. I can't share all of the information that I would usually look out for because it would take too much time. I would also say, like I mentioned in the introduction session, that I think it's tragic that most people, when they make their first purchase or when they're making subsequent purchases of buildings, there's a naivety that exists in most people's heads. We tend to think that because we are experts in a particular area of life, maybe you're a doctor, maybe you're a surgeon, maybe you're an accountant, maybe you're in finance, maybe you work as a barrister, whatever it might be. We tend to think that because we're competent in a particular area of life, that means that we'll be competent in making investment decisions in relation to what I've covered. So most people tend to go for their viewings alone. I made a recommendation. My recommendation was, think about this. When the survey is done, depending on the type of survey you choose, you might be paying up to £500 for the survey. Usually, if a building is over 500,000, and if a building dates to the 1800s to the 1900s, in other words, if it's a period building, a Victorian, a Georgian, an Edwardian, of that age, it's usually advisable to get a structural inspection, which is very different for a survey. A survey in the UK is usually done by a surveyor. Most surveyors are not engineers. A structural survey is done by an engineer, either a structural engineer or a civil engineer. This is more detailed, the structure, because remember what I said, 90% of the value is in the structure and the land. So the surveyor will do a survey, they will identify what they've seen, they'll make recommendations where they think additional structural inspections are necessary, and where specialist contractors should be consulted. If you were doing a structural inspection, this will set you back about £1,000. So let's say you were buying a house that is worth, say, 950,000, and you've decided, I'm going to spend 500,000 first, £500 for the survey, and let's say that the recommendation from the survey is for you to do a structural inspection because of the age of the building. You then pay another 1,000. You get to 1,005. So you spent 1,005. However, if at this stage, before you made the offer, you had a friend or you knew someone who was a civil engineer or structural engineer, or a project manager who's worked in building construction, or a mechanical engineer, or a contractor, a building contractor, it's best to take them along with you if you can. Because you see, everything that I've said to you right now, let's hypothetically imagine that you were doing your viewing, and that's your missus, and you said to me, well, can you join us? Let's assume I joined you. I can make all of these observations, or I would have been able to make all of these observations within a few minutes of being in the building. I could have joined you and I could be there for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and I could walk away. And later on we could meet up for a drink or we could meet up for coffee. And I can say, this is what I think. And this 31,000, I could say to you, well, I think just the external works is about 31,000. My recommendation would be for you to allow, because of, cost of material and the fact that prices change, I say, well, we haven't looked at the inside yet, but I would recommend you allow for 40,000 for all of the repairs before you start upgrading the interior design or the interior fittings. You can go back to the seller and say, I like the price reduced by 40,000. So I've saved you 40,000, which is a lot of money. Plus, I've also saved you having to pay the extra 1,000. Now, that does not mean you shouldn't do that, but it means at this stage you can say, well, 40,000, I don't think I'm interested in proceeding with the offer. You can walk away. So always consult someone else for expert opinion if you can. If you have friends, if you know people, it's always best not to try to make these decisions alone. No one does it all by themselves. We all sit under the shades of the trees that were planted by other people. So have the humility and have the confidence to just juxtapose those two together. Humility and confidence. Have the humility to ask for help. Have the confidence that you will get help if you ask. Remember this. You don't have to remember everything that I've just said, but I'd like you to go through the video a few times, and if you do find it useful, then that's great. In the next session, session number 3, I'll go into detail on the interior and what to look out for.